welcome to How to Talk About Games today. Hopefully you're in the right place. And we're going to talk a little bit about how to talk about games. All right.
Phone.
Oh yeah, I'm supposed to tell you to silence your cell phones. I'm supposed to tell you to please fill out the evaluation thingy. You can fill it out now. Right?
Just say
It's going to be a great talk. So there you go. So on and so forth. And with that, at the end, if you like or are interested in some of the things that we present and you want more information, we have little cards up here with a URL on the back of them of stuff that we've put together so that folks, they look like this, so that you can go get more stuff if you want it. All right. So why does this even matter to you, right? So a lot of the things that are happening right now around games and the way that we talk about games in the public sphere and the way that folks are concerned or interested in their effects and the way that they're consumed in society, that can result in a number of different things. So one of the things that can happen there is that the legislative and political bodies take a look at something and they decide that they're going to make new rules around to fix what they perceive to be as a problem in that space, right? It also sort of forms part of the cultural basis of why and how the general public thinks about games, right? So when you go home and you talk to your mom about video games, like what do they think about video games? And what do their friends think about video games? And how do we as a society sort of think about games in general? And what does that mean? And when certain issues hit the mass media, when they hit the newspaper, when they hit the talk shows, when they hit the news cycles, et cetera, that can start to sway public opinion this way, that way, what have you. And then last but not least, all of that discussion, right, influences, we're raising kids, they're getting mixed messages from the media in and of themselves. So how do they think about games, and how does that sort of inform the next generation around what they think about games? So we were all talking about this sort of behind the scenes with each other because we're usually friends. Yeah, I know, right? And we were having a discussion about it. We said, hey, maybe we should throw together a panel on this because it's fairly timely right now. So we did. These are my esteemed colleagues and panelists. They all have a great number of fancy titles next to their names. They will probably introduce themselves as they get up and talk so that they'll cover what their fancy titles actually mean. But in the background of all of those fancy titles, there's a lot of organizational leadership in the folks that are sitting up here right now. We've got a Canada Research Chair that used to be president of DIGRA. We've got leadership in Global Game Jam. We've got leadership in Higher Education Video Game Alliance, so on and so forth, right? And so just a wealth of experience in different ways that these issues have impacted some of the organizations in and around games with that. So what am I actually talking about when I say, these issues, stuff like that, right? And I'm sure that you can all name them, but just to sort of put a point on it, right? So the games and violence debate, the games and addiction debate, right? Games are addictive now, and we're going to classify that in the health organization. Games and health more generally, right? Games and their effect on society, so on and so forth. One of my personal favorites was the one where we don't, the problem with unemployment is because we make video games, and so young men don't want jobs anymore. I found it particularly interesting. Right? So why are we here? So this session is about understanding the background of some of these recent discussions, and then a call to action for developers to start to have a voice in and around some of these debates directly as somebody that knows something about making video games, rather than not being a part of that engagement. So with that, here we go.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Lindsay Grace, and I'm going to be talking about moral panic and misunderstanding. So last year, I wrote a couple of articles for CNN and some other venues, Associated Press, and also sat on a panel around discussing the new World Health Organization's classification of games addiction and this debate around games and violence and whether or not shooters are somehow inspired by games. So what I'm here to do is to actually help you understand that we've actually been here before. So the first place we'll start is comic books. So in the last century, comic books were considered the source of much debate. My favorite quote of the era is from Frederick Wertham, who wrote the book Seduction of the Innocent. And Frederick explicitly claimed to Senate that he thinks Hitler was a beginner compared to the comic book industry. And this is in the context of 1940s US. So basically, it was widely debated as to whether or not comic books were the source of juvenile delinquency. Book burnings commenced, and this is one of them. And generally, comic books were considered dangerous. The same comic books that have inspired lots of contemporary media. At some point, what you'll see in the history is that all leisure seems subject to moral panic. So we'll go back to the Puritans to start. This is a great little article from Sports Illustrated, and Robert Doyle basically describes and highlights the Puritans' supporting of the burning of the Book of Sports. If you're unfamiliar with the Book of Sports, it was basically a 1600s era guide to Sunday sport and recreation for after church. It was publicly burned in England in 1643 because it was dangerous and evil. Later, if you go through the histories of the Industrial Revolution, for example, you could read Cunningham's Leisure in the Industrial Revolution, you'll learn about the fact that class, religion, and ideological tensions existed around things as trivial as tourism. So, for example, there are discussions about how travel, music, and racing, the new leisures available to a middle class, were actually part of an antisocial culture. And then there's Dungeons and Dragons. So if you don't know about the Dungeons and Dragons story, I've got to tell you. So I like the way they described it. There was the great 1980s Dungeons and Dragons panic. So there's a great little BBC Magazine article, you can read about it. And explicitly, D&D, Dungeons and Dragons, was accused of inspiring suicides, occult activity, being aligned with rape, prostitution, sadism, sex perversion, all kinds of things. In fact, it was actually linked to a murder by a man. The man who committed the murder was Darren Molitor in 1985. And Darren wrote a letter that helped feed this moral panic. In the letter, and I've just highlighted a few things here, he explicitly talks about how Dungeons and Dragons inspired him to be violent, and he described it as possessive, addictive, and evil. So D&D was once addictive and inspired violence. You'll start to see a trend here. So the founding of an organization called Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons, inspired by MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, was founded by a woman named Pat Poling. And in '83, BAD went out and set forth to help people get away from the addictive properties of D&D. One of the things that this person did, Pat Poling actually created a book called The Devil's Web, where she talks about the intersection of Satan and entertainment. And she became the director of the National Coalition on TV Violence. The National Coalition on TV Violence actually earned the support of the US Surgeon General, at the time it was C. Everett Koop, who did believe that TV was part of the problem for violence, which brings us to television. So if you think about television, in the history of analyzing TV and its effects on aggression, we actually have more than 40 years of data and analysis. One of the claims that was proven in a study, like this study, is actually that third graders become more violent from watching TV even 10 years later. This is a study published in '72. And we also, that there is a clear, positive correlation between TV violence and aggressive behavior. This is from another study published in '94. So of course, you must be asking, science proves that television fosters aggression. Yes. Except after 40 years, some people are still saying no. So in this example, which is a study from 2008, it does not, their understanding of the relationship indicates that they do not correlate properly. So there are lots of publications and lots of peer-reviewed, high-quality research that actually says there's no link between violence and TV. Then there's the next one, television addiction. So one of the best, I think, quotes from this Scientific American publication that the famous Mihai Csikszentmihalyi and Kubi actually wrote together is that most of the criteria for substance abuse or substance dependence can apply to people who watch a lot of TV. What do you think about how pervasive television is in many modern cultures? And I actually did some quick research. So there's an OECD publication that talks about how people use their leisure time. And at this point, across the 19 countries that were surveyed, it's about 39% of our leisure. So when you're not working, you're almost a 50% chance that you're watching TV. And we have some results, some research that claims that if you look at meta-analysis, so you look at the different previous studies, you'll find that there's actually a smaller effect of violent video games than television violence, which I think is an interesting observation given how much society is not worried about TV. So that brings us to games. If we talk about games, I think one approach, theme of the presentations that we're all giving, one way to talk about games is actually to remind people of our worldwide political past with leisure. So I gave you these references, right? Point them to the moral panics that have occurred before, when people were worried that if we allowed people to go and be tourists, they would lose their connection to religion, or that we were burning books because we thought that they were dangerous, or that we really did believe in Dungeons and Dragons being a very dangerous and addicting experience. And then also point them to the people who misled us to the detriment of the people they were looking to help. We wanted happy, healthy children, and some people had some approaches that seem questionable. So, remind people and really highlight this idea that there is a dangerous game of pitting leisure against morality, and that leisure itself is political. Attacking leisure is an opportunity to chip at culture and enforce your own culture. It's a little bit of a culture war. So, as scientists, politicians, and journalists claim the detriments of comic books, that they would drive innocent children into the clutches of juvenile delinquency, others actually highlighted the fact that comic books attracted a high quotient of creative people who basically got access to a new publishing venue. So it really offered them opportunities that other modes of publishing didn't. So attacking games kind of mirrors the past attacks on leisure that we've seen historically. And in an era of declining leisure, where in the US, workism is becoming the new religion, and work may even be killing us, maybe we should not attack leisure. We should ask about the root of these discords, of this discord. So like TV, no matter what, it's going to be a long time. If we can ever make these links, it's going to take us a long time to do it. But I remind you, as people at GDC, that games don't need to be burned to be erased. Erasing our cultural contribution is much easier. And if you'd like, we're going to give you a bunch of links to some things that help you understand how all this works together. Thanks. That's all I have.
There we go. Thanks. I drew the short straw and got to talk about games and violence. I'm Mia Consalvo. I'm the Canada Research Chair in Game Studies and Design. And yeah, I'm just basically doing a deep dive into what Lindsay was alluding to in terms of the research, mostly the social science research on games and their links to violence, aggression, that kind of thing. And I would point out also that this is one of the most heavily scrutinized areas of research that you will come across. If I did a study in this particular field, I would be scared to death to publish it because you're just immediately jumped on, and everything is just as it should be. It should be carefully reviewed, but there is a ton of people looking at this research and making saying if it is up to scratch. It is not just research about games and violence, though, that's been problematic or called into account. If you pay attention to the news, you may notice social science research in general has been having a rough time. You may hear the word replication crisis being used. Basically what happened is, especially a lot of research in psychology, you remember at university, those sophomores, they get called to do, for extra credit, you do the research. And some of those early studies that had very influential findings people are finally getting around to replicating some of them, and some of them are not holding up to scrutiny. One of the biggest examples is the marshmallow test. So if you remember, this is the one where you put a kid in a room with a plate of marshmallows, and you're like, I don't know like exactly how you do it, but you see how long they can wait, and you know, if they can avoid eating the marshmallow, and it's all about grit, right? And if you can avoid eating the marshmallow, then 10 years down the line, you're gonna get into Stanford, right? And your life is gonna be cake and wonderful. And what the replication found was that, well, no, actually, it's more about your background and your socioeconomic class that leads you to be able to resist the marshmallow rather than some inner grit. So yeah, a lot of social science research you really just need to take with a grain of salt and see, you know, like, is it standing up? And also, you know, as Lindsay was saying, this is culture. You know, people are changing and our culture is changing, and so we can't just say, if we found something once in the past, it's necessarily going to hold up. To games and violence, however, if you are looking for an actual book to read on this topic, and you're not allergic to academic prose, I would highly recommend Barry Gunter's 2016 Does Playing Video Games Make Players More Violent? I have the title in the handout, you know, on the website. It's 280 pages. I read all of them. The panelists know because I've told them this repeatedly. I think reading the book at times made me violent more than a video game has probably made anyone violent. But it's a very thorough accounting of like hundreds of the studies over the past looking at games and violence. So this is a big block of text, but what he's basically saying here is just that video game playing doesn't occur in a social vacuum, right? Like, it's a part of our culture and our daily life. We have, you know, a socioeconomic background. We live in certain places. We have different educations. We have different genders. All of these things play a role. And as he says, going one step further to differentiate between the effects of violent video games as distinct from those of violent movies, you know, and watching in a movie theater or programs seen on TV is even more challenging. It's so incredibly hard with people to like pull out one particular thread of what they do, you know, to say, how does this, you know, affect the whole rest of their life? How can we hold every other element of people's lives constant, you know, to see? You know, so that's like a really key thing to think about. And again, placing this in context, Lindsay did this, so I'll just go through it quickly, but there have been studies, you know, and it does relate to moral panics, but people worried about movies, people worried about television. The cultivation model in the 80s basically said if you watch a lot of violent TV, maybe you wouldn't become aggressive, but you would think the world is a mean and scary place, much more than it actually was. And a lot of the early research, even on violent games, tended to link violent media together in terms of when you studied populations. And so you can't even pick out like how this, you know, did games do something, because it was just, this is like people who watch violent TV and movies and that kind of thing. When you get to the research on games themselves, there are three types of studies that you see. So there are surveys where you're having, you know, children or adults fill out detailed questionnaires about their media use, their backgrounds, their personality type, that kind of thing. You have naturalistic observation, where perhaps you go to playgrounds and watch people play and then try and infer that and maybe talk with them later about like their media diet to see if there are any correlations. And then you have experiments where, you know, you set people up in a lab and you like have them play a game and then take a survey or, you know, interact in some way. So there are problems associated with all of these types of methods. So for surveys, you can't actually prove causality, right? The most that you can do is actually find a correlation. You know, people who play a lot of, you know, Grand Theft Auto are also maybe arguing a lot with their teachers, but you don't know. Maybe they argue a lot with their teachers and then they go play Grand Theft Auto, right? Like, there's no one way that you can see that the evidence is pointing that one necessarily leads to the other. If you're observing people in a setting, you have little control over the actual setting. It's not a population sample. This is just a very convenient sample, and you can't control the variables. And with experiments, it's an artificial setting, you know, so you're having people come into a lab and play a video game. And I mean, it's just completely unnatural, but also in terms of effect time, because maybe they're having them fill out a survey or react to something. So you might be able to say like, oh, they got a little angry 15 minutes after my test, but you don't know necessarily maybe then they got over it a day, a week, a month later, right? So it's really hard with experiments to show anything beyond immediate effect. Other critiques that people have made of some of the research on violence in games. Studies can examine, these seem kind of similar, but they're actually very different things that people are looking at. Violent thoughts, violent feelings, and violent behaviors, right? They're not all the same thing. If you have a thought about what you might do to somebody who cuts you off in traffic, that doesn't mean that you necessarily go and do the thing, right? The thought and the behavior, even though you'd really like to, are not equivalent. The feeling, you may have rage directed, at the person who cut you off in traffic. That does not necessarily mean you're going to do the thing. So you have to look at what the studies are actually studying. Studies use different measures and definitions of what aggression actually is. Some have tried to standardize over time, and they have standardized like personality tests or definitions, like they carry over from one study to another, but especially a lot of the early research varied wildly in terms of what they said about them. And there are ethical concerns about using and testing actual aggression, right? You can't just say, I'm gonna have kids play this game, and then I'm gonna have another kid go up and punch the kid to see if he punches him back, right? Like, ethics review boards really don't like you to do that kind of thing. And so you have to develop substitutes for what an aggressive act might be. So a really common one is the noise blast. You're playing with somebody else and you want to punish them, and it's like, how loud a blast of noise do you give them? And that's like a substitute. Is a loud noise blast really the same thing as punching someone? Another substitute is hot sauce. You want to punish somebody, how much hot sauce are you putting on like food that they're being given? Culturally, this is really weird to me. I'd be like, more hot sauce, please. Like, you just don't like me, you didn't put much on there. If you go through again all of this literature, there are two major theories or approaches in terms of trying to figure out like these links. There's the general aggression model, the GAM, which Craig Anderson is one of the leading researchers on, which is mostly focusing on thoughts, as installing scripts for behavior that you play these games and you're learning reactions, and that's gonna influence then what you actually do. And then in counterpoint, the catalyst model, which is Chris Ferguson. Chris Ferguson has been like one of the most active opponents of the GAM and their research and calling out their methods. And he says that, their findings are just suspect. And he looks at things like personality and environmental factors. Everyone does agree it's not a simple issue. Gosh, thanks, it's complicated. But they'll say things like, it depends on a player's neighborhood, their family history, their school performance, their friends, personality, social history, media diet, gender, mental health, and so on and so on and so on, right? And so what they all do at least agree on is that what you're looking for are risk factors associated. But again, figuring out, and they argue about what those risk factors might be and the best ways to do them. You'll also hear people talk about the meta-analyses, the big studies that take all the studies and say, well, maybe if we cram them all together, we'll see if we learn something as a result. The problem here is that if you take crappy studies and put them together, you just get a really big, really crappy study. You're
This
not
is my whole
eliminating-
talk, Mia, is meta studies. You're just killing me here. You're killing me.
So, yeah. Another problem, thank you, Roger. Another problem with these meta-analyses is a lot of them focus on research that has been published. There is a publication bias many times. If you do a study and you find no significant results, a lot of journals don't want to publish it because it doesn't seem very exciting, even though in violence research, no significant results might be important. And so you're leaving out those studies and their lack of results. Scientists have different ways of interpreting the results. What one might consider a moderate effect, one might consider, a minor effect. And so again, there's just no clear-cut consensus. Some are very convinced of, their truth, but there is no complete consensus overall. I'm kind of over time, so just getting really nitpicky. Not all games are violent. People don't always play them just for the violent parts. The research tends to conflate research on little kids, young kids, 17-year-olds, and adults without separating them out and how they might be different. Some of the studies don't really mention, are women and girls involved. A few do, but not all of them, so we don't really know conclusively about gender. And just to close up, another way to approach this is to ask, what do people do with games, right? How are they using them in their lives? What are they taking away from them? What are they bringing to them? Rather than asking, what do games do to people? Thanks.
Looks like me. Perfect. Thank you, Doc. Appreciate it. I'm Roger. It's nice to see everyone here. I collect titles. I work at Queensland University of Technology, Entertainment Arts and Engineering at Utah, and all sorts of other fun things. I like that workaholism. I'm a lucky guy. I get to work with talented people and talented students to make games. Sometimes they're for entertainment, and sometimes they are for health. And so we have a lab that we work in where we're making games in a hospital to sort of help people with all sorts of different things, ranging from helping disabled people ski again and or sail again, to doing all sorts of things with medication compliance and things like that. So I sort of have a vested interest in this notion, just to put all my biases out there, about games as an industry and prepping people to work in a games industry, and then also games as medicine, and that games are good for you. In fact, I've done a lot of talks when I first started doing work in medicine on, are games good for you and how can games help people out? People love talking about the negative aspects of games. I think that came through in the previous talks, and there's been lots of it. I think if you Google games are bad for you, lots of fun stuff pops up, right? So there's like no lack of it. But oddly enough, lots of good stuff pops up as well. And I think this is one of the shifts that we're starting to see, that you would be surprised who is writing about the positive impacts of games, right? And the kinds of things that they're asking about. So like, for example, on the vegan article, they're talking about, games are good for you, lots of reasons why games are good for you. A call for responsible play, so this emphasis on personal responsibility, that's an important shift. We're going to talk about that a little bit, how we stop looking at the stimuli or the thing itself, and we start looking at behavior and responsible behavior, right? I mean, of course, the same concerns that everyone always has, but it's an interesting shift to see what happens. It's already been addressed that there is there is great academic work on games on sort of both sides of this debate, if you believe there are two sides. Really, there's just a lot of thought on there. It's kind of hard to boil it down into two camps. And on addiction, though, we're seeing a shift in the way people talk about addiction. So in the beginning, people liked to talk about media in the same ways that they would talk about addictive substances. So you would talk about games the same way you might talk about a chemical substance or a drug, right? And certainly they could point to lots of negative things that happen around games. And I think it's important for us when we talk about games, especially when we talk about games in the press, not to sort of sweep these things under the rugs. Whether it's through academic study or anecdotes, people have stories about negative things around game play, right? Just as we laugh when we talk about negative things around driving, we don't have to hide that. We don't have to say driving is good all the time, that every time you get behind the wheel of a car, it's a delightful experience, right? Mia wants to kill people, apparently, when she gets behind the wheel of a car, so I'm going to add that bullet point to this slide, right? And I think that when we talk about negative aspects of leisure or negative aspects of games, in particular as leisure, we're not alone in this. So one of the things that we don't hear much about is exercise addiction, right? And exercise addiction isn't a new thing. This is something that's been studied since the 70s. There are places where you can be treated for exercise addiction. There are lots of great articles on exercise addiction. Being an exercise addict is a very serious condition. It can affect your body in tremendous ways. It reduces your longevity. It can compromise your immune system. There are all sorts of terrible things that happen. But when we talk about exercise, this isn't what comes up, right? We don't talk about exercise addiction when we have general conversations about exercise. And the reason for that is because exercise is good for you. This is known, right? Even though it is addictive, even though people get hurt by it, even though some of the cultures around where we do exercise are very complicated and under debate right now, the idea when we talk about exercise, if I were to say, hey, let's talk about exercise, none of you are going to say, oh, that's terrible. Exercise is the worst. It's addictive and you might be exposed to toxic cultures and oh my God, exercise, don't get me started, right? No, because you work with the assumption that exercise is good for you. And so we can actually have conversations about those things and not worry that we're going to get rid of exercise and start having gym membership burning parties. I mean, I don't even know what that would look like, right? So what if instead of always apologizing for games, we started with something else? What if we started with games are good for you, right? What if that was the assumption? And so to get to this notion that games are good for you, we might have to start talking about the things about games that are good for you, not just the right to be entertained, that is a valuable thing, or to engage and leisure time, but are there things about games that are good for you? There are lots of great individual studies on this kind of stuff, both from social scientific and medical research. This, for example, is a single study on the game Bejeweled that shows that it has the impact that playing Bejeweled for 30 minutes a day, 3 times a week, has the same impact on state and trait anxiety. State anxiety is what we all experience when you get stressed out when something bad happens, or trait anxiety, you just deal with generalized anxiety. It has the same impact as low-dose benzos, so low-dose Valium or low-dose Xanax, right? And that it's a wonderful study because they do all this biometric stuff. It's a good study. And they sort of show that unlike a lot of things that are prescribed, like people don't take their medications when they're prescribed to them. When they were prescribed to video games, they took them more than the recommended dosage, right? And so they were prescribed a half-hour of play. Average amount of play was just over 40 minutes, right? So get your Bejeweled on. But rather than looking at a bunch of individual studies, Mia already alluded to that meta studies and meta reviews are wonderful and extraordinarily useful, and there's just never anything to critique about them. We looked at each other's work, I swear. No, but in reality, though, this is actually a great place to start when you want to start looking for research, are meta reviews. So a good meta review, like this is a report that was sponsored by a center in Australia, and they looked at 200 different articles on well-being and children and games and sort of extract themes from it, right? And so it's a good place to sort of start the conversation. Clearly, these things are never definitive, right? But they looked at a lot of research, like we said, over 200 peer-reviewed, published articles, again, with caveats for all the things that Mia mentioned. And they sort of talked about positive emotional impacts of games, the healthy relationships that come from games, and social capital. Social capital is sort of the things we use in life to exchange with one another that aren't monetary related but are like cool, right? So you could say, hey, look, I have a really cool mount, or I'm really high level in WoW, and other people might say, oh, that's really great. So that's social capital that you can exchange, right? And then the impact on self-esteem, the positive impact on self-esteem. The citation for this will also be on the website. That's on that handout if you need it. But when we talked about the positive emotional impact, or when that article talks about it, they sort of looked at mental well-being with video games, that it's a good way to relax, it's a good way to not feel stressed out. These are things that you might already believe, but there's research that talks about this, that people who play games tend not to have depressed mood as much, that oddly enough, that a lot of the research has a horseshoe-shaped pattern, meaning that those who don't play games and those who play excessive amounts of games have depressive mood problems, but those that play moderate games have less of this than people who don't play games, right? And we actually see this with obesity as well, that there's arguments about obesity in games, and that those who don't play games and those who play excessive games are more likely to suffer from childhood obesity than those who play moderate amounts of games as well. So that pattern seems to emerge a lot. That in terms of healthy relationships, that people who play games tend to have less risky friendship networks, high levels of family closeness, and that people in games like WoW are sometimes, they find this a safe space to discuss things that might be difficult for them to discuss interpersonally, right? And so the use of avatars and the use of the game means that they can sort of talk about things in their life that they might be uncomfortable talking about IRL. This is actually true in other studies as well. So with adults, adults who've returned from war and are suffering from PTSD, there's been great work that some people are more comfortable talking to a virtual counselor than a real counselor, that they can be more honest and more forthcoming with an avatar than they can another person in the room. In terms of self-esteem, we sort of see that a lot of players feel they can express themselves more. They feel empowered and confident to express their sexuality, their appearance. They're not afraid of these things, and that virtual worlds can sort of give people a break from this stuff. This is not the only meta review on this. There's lots of them. This one is pretty interesting though, because it was published by the APA, the American Psychological Association, in their premier journal, American Psychologist. The American Psychological Association has a complex relationship with games, right? They've come out on the other side of this games addiction debate in the past, right? And so you might have seen news articles that say things like, American Psychological Association has concerns about games addiction. But at the same time, they are publishing work on the healthy benefits of playing games in their major journal, right? Which is pretty interesting. So this is another article that sort of analyzes dozens of other articles. And instead of saying what are the social aspects of it, it says that there are cognitive benefits to games, that the types of things that we learn, in fact, they do a really interesting analysis of articles about first-person shooters that show that playing first-person shooters teaches you spatial reasoning and other skills at the same level as taking high-level college courses in them, that they're good for motivation, that they have for emotional health, and that they're very social, right? So it's a great review of these kinds of things. But the point of it isn't these articles that I'm talking about. It's that we don't have to dismiss that maybe some people who play games have bad experiences or that bad things happen to them around games. We would be lying if that were the case, right? No one hates love, but clearly people have been hurt in love, right? There wouldn't be a pop music industry if people didn't get hurt in love, right? But that talking about the positive aspects of games might get us to a place where we can say games are good for you and still have honest conversations about everything else, right? And that just because some people have a bad experience, it doesn't mean that's a defining characteristic of the thing itself, right? That's all I have for you. You feel free to email me any questions you might have. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So now I got stuck in this panel with the joy of going right after Roger. It's always interesting. So my name's Andy. I also collect titles. I'm a professor of human interface technology at Canterbury, which is at Christchurch. I'm also a professor of art and design at RIT. I'm a game scholar in residence at American right now. And probably most relevant to this particular talk, I'm president of the Higher Education Video Game Alliance. And I became president of the Higher Education Video Game Alliance about mid-2017, around Thanksgiving time. It was really nice. My very good friend and colleague was the prior president, Constance Steinkühler, and we were kind of discussing as a board like who was going to take it on next, and you know, she talked me into it, as she has a way of doing. And she said, well, you know, I want to tell you, right, like, you know, I think you're going to have a pretty smooth sailing here with your tenure with HEVGA. Like, it's not going to be that big of a deal because she used to be assigned to the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House. And she said, when we were there, right, Sandy Hook happened. And we got called to a meeting in Joe Biden's office to talk about video games. So if that doesn't happen to you, like, you know, like you're going to have an easier time of it than I did, right? So it's going to be okay. And so that was fun. And then it got to be about January. And we had another school shooting. And the President of the United States opened his mouth about how that was the fault of video games. So it took 3 months. Great. that was really super. I particularly do enjoy the fact, though, that his tweet was actually from 2012 that everyone referenced in response to that debate. It was pretty great. So pretty much then, right, like everything old is new again. That's what happened in Washington in the wake of the shooting in Florida. And so what was interesting and a little bit different, though, was I got a bunch of folks in the industry saying, it'll blow over, this always happens, like we shouldn't worry about issuing statements and coming out on these sides of these issues and this, that, and the other. And then eventually, right, like Trump said, no, we're going to have a meeting in the White House and we're going to make the game executives show up and answer for this and da-da-da-da-da. And then they had that meeting and basically everybody yelled at each other and nobody was, it wasn't like the optics of having a meeting at the White House sort of means you're going to yell at each other because that makes for a better news story. But that's, kind of what happened, right? Except that in the background of all of that, there's some really interesting things that happened, right? So one was that issue got referred to the Commission for School Safety that had to issue a report back to the president over the course of the next year, the School Safety Commission report. I'm willing to bet that most of you have not read it, all right? It's pretty dry, gotta be honest. One of the things that's interesting about that, though, is that it specifically calls out the Motion Picture Association of America and their rating systems as inadequate, but it does not call out video games. And one of the reasons for that is that there was a bunch of sustained advocacy behind the fact because organizations like mine, like the ESA, like the IGDA, were making those articles that said the research is not conclusive, right, that violent video games causes school shootings, right? And so that was a very necessary point of advocacy to continue to protect this medium that we love. And I just talked over my next slide. So how does this affect you, right? Well, it affects you because, if they decided that it did, right, we could all be legislated out of making certain kinds of content pretty darn quickly, right? We have a really great precedent with the Supreme Court case from a few years ago about, games being, first-person protected speech and all of that, right? I don't know if you've noticed this, but the balance of the court has shifted a little bit since that was tried. I'm not willing to go down the road and say it'll always be upheld. You never know, right? So, and then, okay, so that was like my first 3 months on the job, and then we had this, winning. So then the World Health Organization comes out and says, we're going to have a classification around addiction in games, right? And I watched a bunch of my academic colleagues, right, who just did the very same thing that we kind of did with games and violence. It said the research is not clear, that the studies are this, and we need, it's going to take a long time to figure this stuff out, and this kind of research is very difficult, and it's not definitive, and so on and so forth, right? And I was sitting here on mailing lists watching colleagues that said that those very things about violence turn around and say, yeah, but man, kids can't stop playing Fortnite. Like, we got to do something about this, like right now, right? And you're like, but the, if you're really into that particular issue, right, I would tell you there's a really great panel discussion at Games for Change in 2018. And the woman that's very dark on there is Kelly Dunlop, and you should check her out because her work in this space is probably some of the most down-to-earth and reasonable around what addiction, addiction is a really loaded word, right? There's a medical classification for it, but the way we use it popularly has very little to do with that. And so that's an issue. Behind the scenes, if you're in and out of DC the way I am, the way you have been, one of the things you will notice is the standard age of the American lawmaker. And there are some big generational divides regarding attitudes about games. So we all love these little stats, right? That's like everybody plays games, right? There's, like 97% of everyone ever plays games, and we've been playing games since the dawn of time and all this kind of stuff. But we play very different kinds of games based on our age, a lot, right? We classify a lot of things in American politics as this left-right debate. right? But the real debate is old young, right? And so this was a really interesting article that just came out not too terribly long ago about the eligible voters and their age. And what you see is that there are some really, really big generations that are in like early retirement age right now, and that's not going to phase out until like after 2045. Right? So the way that we talk about media, there's some issues there. The other thing that I think is really interesting is that we're all at GDC and we're all developers and we make games and we know how games are made and we know some of the motivations behind them and what the industry kind of looks like a little bit and so on and so forth. This is how most people think games get made. Right? So there's an idea person and then elves and then game, right? Just talk to like freshmen that come into games programs, right? They're like, I want to be the idea guy, right? Like, right? So there isn't this public narrative about how games get made. And yet when you think about film, right? Like a 3-year-old knows that there's actors and a script and that gets turned into a thing, right? And then you say, well, how does a game get made? And I don't really know, right? Something with a computer, I think, right? So it's no wonder that they're trying to, that there's a lot of fear and moral panic around what these things do to us because they don't understand how they're made, what they are, and how they're being consumed, and thus their effect, right? We've talked a lot about some big national examples, but the way this trickles down, it can be state by state, it can be local district, it can be how games are perceived by the librarian at your local library, right? It can be like Vermont just tried to ban the sale of violent video games independently, just as a state legislature action, and that fortunately died on the governor's desk because there's really no way to enforce it presently. But it was an interesting piece of legislation to see just kind of float right out there. There's some efforts right now to legislate loot crates starting out of Hawaii, so on and so forth. So what I would say to you is that if we profess to really care about this medium, to aspire to games as art, and to hold ourselves to the highest academic and professional standards, then that also means using the knowledge that we have and the passion for this medium that we hold, right, to defend it, right? It means not being silent, right? And a lot of times we're silent because like, well, if we say the wrong thing, like it's gonna go on Twitter and then bad things happen and so on, right? But if you don't say anything, right, you're seeding a void for other people to fill in that discussion. I think Roger probably did it better than I did, right? But let's just remember that games have done some awesome things along the way for culture, both in education and just purely as a form of entertainment. So in conclusion, beware the media rumor, please, okay? A lot of popular press articles will take some of the academic work that like Mia was citing or that Roger was citing and pick out what they think would be a really nice headline, even if it doesn't exactly match what the study says, right? And then that gets condensed into a social media soundbite and so on and so forth, right? And so there's very little meat sometimes to what that looks like. And so remember that we've been here before in our history of moral panics, particularly in this country, but also in others. Beware of unpublished or preliminary research or research that had a particular sponsor with an agenda. You see that sometimes in this space. Most importantly, I think, is to seek some empathy with the motivations of parents, right? Because really, I mean, they just want their kids to be okay, right? And that's the point, right? And so, they're scared sometimes reading some of these articles, or they're scared that schools are getting shot up and, this kind of stuff. And so they're knee-jerking for answers that are easy, that they think they have some control, right? Remember that you are an expert on the creation of games, right? Most people have no idea how they're made.
Hear, hear.
Our relationship with games is complex. A lot of times the research is less clear than any headline will ever allow. The way we talk about games influences a lot of what is said about them and where the future research is targeted, right? So whatever we're saying, the public debate around games shapes the kinds of research that's going to be funded the next time that money is allocated for research funding to look at this stuff, right? So what we say actually matters because that influences the things that we're going to be able to go and explore and hopefully find out. And you make a difference when you speak as a games creator, as a researcher, or as a professional. And like I said, a lot of the information that we packed into the panel is on this little website that we made, which is on the back of that card. And I'll also tweet the link after the talk and stuff. And with that, we get to the good stuff. So it's Q&A time.
Do we have Q&A time?
We have Q&A time. We have
10 minutes.
10 minutes. All right. So
Ah,
we got a little
perfect.
bit.
So we have short Q&A time, and so we would actually really
And we
appreciate
do have
it.
a wrap-up room, too.
Yeah, we
in
have a wrap-up room.
204.
Yeah. If you would ask questions rather than giving comments or micro speeches, right? And so everyone will be so much happier if you do. And in fact, the best question gets a bag of kangaroo meat, right? So, so hop on up and ask a good question.
All the way from Australia.
It's from Australia. There you go.
97% Australian.
97% from Australia. Yeah.
Endorsed by Vegan Times.
All right. What was the first question?
All right. One topic that wasn't breached here is VR. And VR, I think, is fundamentally different because it strives to be ultimately indistinguishable from reality. It strives to replace sensory input of reality itself with something synthetic. And in that case, something violent is you carrying out a violent action. It is not through a proxy or through make-believe. There's no, ultimately, in its ideal form, no awareness that it isn't real other than the memory of going into VR.
So the CNN editorial that I actually wrote addresses this succinctly because there was a Stanford faculty member researcher who had the same opinion and raised the fact, he actually made design suggestions, like if we curve the bullets, then at least we're not training people to be good. Yeah. So I have a full response to that. And I don't think that increased realism drives us to be the kinds of people who would do heinous acts.
But the question wasn't increased realism necessarily, but the distinctional difference between something that happens in a rectangle and something that you have a first direct experience of with your senses, the way reality interacts with your senses.
Sure.
Yeah, I guess I would argue though that right, like it's not just about senses, right? Human beings are more than just right a response to particular stimuli. Right? There's a contextual awareness about what you're doing, right? So unless it's the Matrix where you don't know you're in the Matrix and you're being powered by batteries in the background, like you knew you put a VR headset on, you knew that you're engaged with a fantasy environment, right? That is not in present day reality, right? So on and so forth. So the contextual understanding, right, of what you're doing and why you're doing it and the motivation behind that, right, is still wildly different, right, than the physical act, right, of what would happen in say like soldier training, where you know that in fact you're training for a real life scenario where you are going to be shot at or are going to be shooting. So it's again, right, there's we can a lot of people will point to the graphics, will point to the realism, right, but the behavior, right, is something that we don't really, it's much stickier than that.
I sympathize with what you're saying because we frequently speak out of both sides of our mouth on this kind of stuff, where we say like for training, for surgery, it's just like being a surgeon, right?
Exactly.
Or for what it is to have the refugee experience, it's just like the simulated empathy machine, right? So I get it. But at the same time, I think that if you look at play and make-believe, people have been role-playing all sorts of experiences with various levels of realism, with and without computer mediation. There are live-action role-playing organizations that rent ships and all dress in authentic gear, but they never stab each other, right? Like when they're like they feel like pirates or they look like spaceship star troopers or whatever the thing is they're doing is. But because you play that thing, we're good at differentiating that. People are good at differentiating that. And when people can't differentiate reality from fantasy, there's actually a disease for that, right? And so I don't know that technology is the problem with this, the separation between those two things. We'll happily talk to you out in the hallway though more if you'd like.
All right,
if that's cool. Thanks.
Hello, I come from parallel industry. I'm working for Asmodee Corporation, so we are doing board games.
Yeah.
And have you have you ever within your research where this topic of analog games were covered? Can I look for something interesting?
Has there been any work on analog games and violence, like
I mean
board
the
game violence?
D&D, of course, yeah, but
Yeah.
then
Not that
but
I'm
the
familiar with.
D&D is a good example, though, right?
Yeah.
and something other, because we are funding this kind of research, and if someone is interested, I would like to
Yeah.
share.
I think
A
one of the-
challenge that also researchers face is, like I have colleagues who say, like when you're getting grants, like, why don't you approach the game industry for funding? And I'm like, ha ha ha. They're not going to give me money, but also the sense that I want to be independent, because
Okay.
if I say this study was sponsored by EA, people are going to give
Got
me
it.
the eye,
Got it,
right?
got
And
it.
say, how independent were you really?
There are plans for conferences, and this stuff.
Cool.
But yeah, for example, we just launched a document for how games manually are helping people with Alzheimer
yeah.
disease. Yeah,
That's super
so
cool.
this kind of stuff we are looking for. If someone
I would love to talk to you
interested.
afterward. There's a
Okay.
whole world of health games researchers
Okay.
that I think would be super interested.
Okay, thank you.
Do you want to switch here to the left? Alternate?
Hi. So I've actually had conversations in this vein before, where talking about publications and kind of the biases that can go into them and the publication stuff. And we during the conversation, the thing was brought up of these positive articles, and somebody who was talking for the other side says, why can't you say all those same things about those? The bias, the fact that it's sensational to say these are good. And we had an interesting conversation about it. I'm curious what you would say would be a good response to saying, like, if you apply those arguments back towards the positive articles.
I need help with the question just a little bit more. I'm sorry.
So basically, for like a lot of the sensationalist ones, the
Yeah.
like old books about D&D and stuff like that.
Yeah.
There was kind of the moral panic. There's some where it's like, this is a very punchy headline that was condensed down.
Got it.
So when the same thing is said about like all these being positive, like all the good things games do.
Yeah. Okay. I got it.
Yeah.
I got it. So because to be perfectly honest, there isn't on the no one's really arguing against those things. So as Mia pointed out, where there might be studies and we go back and forth over a period of time of are games addictive or are games not addictive, we're not seeing articles showing that games don't reduce anxiety. We're not seeing articles that show games are not reducing self-esteem or increasing self-esteem, right? And so there aren't other articles to go back to that say these things aren't happening. And so it's kind of like there are lots of debates where everyone wants to believe there's two sides to the debate, but it's like exercise, right? It's like there are no articles that say that cardiovascular activity in a regular healthy person can't be a wonderful part of their life, right? There's no anti-cardio. I mean, there are some silly things on the internet, right? But there's no anti-cardiovascular activity study group at Stanford, right? And the same is true of the pro-social aspects of games.
Yeah.
Can I just jump into and say that I would agree that I think that all the research should be strictly scrutinized, because it's like if you're going to critique one set of studies, you should be critiquing all sets.
yeah,
It's
of
just
course,
that
yeah.
honestly, when you come up with, you say a nice thing, most people aren't ready to jump on you and be like, prove it, right? I don't think that's true. What's your methodology? Is it a population sample? So that's definitely true. And I would argue, in terms of the broader concerns, I mean, yes, games do impact people. They can impact us poorly. They can impact us in positive ways. It's just far more complicated in terms of how they do that, right? And I think that's true of the positive impacts as much as well.
Yeah, and
Agreed.
I think too, there's, to me, in some of the work that I do and the way that translates into things like policy proposal and legislative action, there's either action or there's not, right? And so to err on the side of not, of not creating more legislation, of not creating new policy, of letting sort of free market just kind of go and do it, its thing, right? I think there's that so to me, right, like what's the harm in having a good a good think piece, right, that makes everybody feel good, right, but like maybe it wasn't completely accurate. I mean, we should strive for accuracy, but who got hurt right there.
We can
Whereas
squeeze in one.
on the other end, right, you do that, and then that biases public opinion, and that creates a a call to action, and we start passing laws about what we're going to allow to be seen and not seen, right? I think that that's a very slippery slope, and so I would hold a piece that's trying to skew public opinion in that way to a high standard, I hope, right? So
on that note, I think we're going to conclude here. We will answer questions in the wrap-up room. We strongly encourage you to give us your feedback via the forms that you now are
and
able
also
to access
take
through your
these
mobile
things if you want them.
phones.
Hey,
Oh,
good.
yes.
Hey, guy with a good hat. You can have it if you want it. You had a great question, and that hat is just amazing. Right? You seem like the person that deserves this. All right. Thank you.